The House of Silence, the Whitmore estate loomed over the edge of the Charleston countryside like a monument carved out of old grief. Its towers reached toward the sky in defiance, its polished marble floors gleamed with relentless perfection, and every chandelier sparkled as though mocking the man who owned it. To the world beyond its iron gates, Charles Whitmore was a figure of wealth and power, a man who had transformed old family fortune into an empire of steel, oil, and international trade. But behind those walls, stripped of public admiration, he was only a father of two fragile boys and a widower who had never found a way to breathe after his wife's death. For years, the mansion had become a mausoleum of order every surface. Spotless, every clock precise, every sound muffled by the weight of unspoken sorrow. The children, Caleb and Carter, had grown up within this silence. Their laughter muted by hesitation, their legs confined by bodies that would not obey, and their spirits gradually bound by the same shadows that suffocated their father, Mayor Williams. Entered this fortress not with fanfare or prestige, but quietly as another member of the house staff. She was a woman of 29, her hands calloused by work, her heart tendered by hardships most of the household could not imagine. She had taken the position of maid not because she lacked skill, but because opportunities for someone like her, poor, black, and without formal letters behind her name, were as scarce as compassion in high society. Yet those who looked past her uniform would have seen the grace with which she carried herself, the steadiness in her gaze, and the quiet hum that followed her through the halls, like the echo of a song she refused to silence. To many it was background noise. To two little boys in the mansion it was the only sound that felt like home. Charles Whitmore had never truly noticed her until the day he stormed into the playroom. He had been walking the corridors with his usual restlessness, his mind gnawed by guilt and fear when he heard the sound of a drum echoing faintly. It wasn't loud or brash, but soft, rhythmic, accompanied by a low humming. It reminded him of nights long gone, when his late wife Rose had sung to the twins in her lap, her voice carrying a fragile kind of faith that even sickness could not steal. The memory pierced him like glass. He followed the sound until he reached the threshold of the playroom, and what he saw inside ignited his fury. There knelt Maya, her dark braid falling over one shoulder as she guided Carter's small hands over the taut skin of a drum. Caleb, his brother, sat nearby shaking a cymbal, maraca, the ghost of a smile on his face. They were moving not in great strides, not in miracles, but in small, trembling gestures that dared to defy the silence of the house. "Get your hands off my son, Maya." His voice cut like a whip. Both boys froze, eyes wide with confusion. Maya lifted her head slowly, her hands still resting lightly on Carter's fingers, her humming dying in her throat. She did not look frightened, though she should have been. The fury etched on Charles's face was not the kind that welcomed explanations. It was the rage of a man who had lost too much and trusted too little, the kind of rage that burned at the thought of false hope. He stormed inside before she could even rise to her feet. His shoes struck the hardwood floor with sharp precision, each step echoing like the hammer of a judge. Caleb shrank back against the wall as Charles's shadow loomed over him. With one quick, violent motion, Charles kicked a maraca out of his hand. It spun across the room with a hollow rattle before slamming against the baseboard. Caleb's lips trembled as tears welled in his eyes. Carter, too stunned to react, clung to his brother's sleeve. Charles turned on the drum next, grabbing it roughly and smashing it against the edge of the bookshelf. The wood cracked with a splintering sound that reverberated through the air, and the boys gasped as though he had struck them. "No more games, no more nonsense. No more you," he roared, glaring at Maya with venom that masked his fear. "This house is not a place for your backwater tricks." The staff had gathered in the hallway by then, drawn by the noise like moths to a flame. They whispered among themselves, their words cruel daggers veiled as murmurs. "Always thought she was better than the rest of us," one sneered under her breath. "Humming lullabies doesn't make you a miracle worker," another added. Their laughter slithered through the air, cold and cutting. Mayo heard every word, but she did not flinch. She rose to her feet slowly, smoothing her blouse, her posture calm though her heart raced. Charles seized her collar roughly, dragging her close, his face inches from hers. His voice was low and sharp, dripping with scorn. "You think this is therapy? You think your songs will make them walk? You're a maid, nothing more. Stay in your place." The boy's cries filled the silence, breaking through his anger. "Daddy, stop!" Caleb's voice cracked, fragile but desperate. "She didn't hurt us." Carter clung to his brother's arm, nodding fiercely through tears. "Maya's good. She helps us." Their words pierced Charles more deeply than any insult could. He blinked, his fury faltering just for a moment, but pride kept him from softening. He released Maya's blouse, his knuckles raw from splinters, and stepped back, chest heaving. Maya adjusted her collar, lifted her chin, and looked him squarely in the eyes. Her voice was calm, even gentle. "I wasn't fixing them. I was helping them remember how it feels to be children." The words unsettled him, struck somewhere deep where grief and guilt festered. But before he could respond, she turned and walked toward the door. The staff parted like a tide, some sneering, others silent. At the threshold she paused, her voice steady but soft. "You've got everything a man could want, Mr. Whitmore, except grace." The word hit him like a blow to the chest. Grace. A word his late wife used often. A word he had banished from his life since her funeral. Before he could recover, Maya disappeared down the hall, her presence lingering like the last note of a song. That night Charles sat alone in his study, recounting the incident to Dr. Feldman, the children's longtime specialist. He described Maya's humming, the drum, the rhythm. Feldman shook his head gravely, sipping his tea with an air of detached authority. "Unlicensed, reckless, dangerous, these children need medical structure, not superstition. You did the right thing, Charles." The words rang hollow, even as Charles nodded in agreement. Something gnawed at him, the way the boys had defended her, the light he had seen in their eyes before his anger shattered it. He told himself he was protecting them, yet deep down he feared he had only destroyed what little hope they had managed to grasp. The following day, Feldman attempted another therapy session. Charles watched from the hallway, his arms crossed, his jaw tight. Caleb refused to cooperate, his small frame rigid with defiance. Carter would not even lift his hand to a flashcard. The doctor coaxed, commanded inside, but the boy sat. Silent, eyes dull, spirits heavy. "Regression," Feldman muttered with irritation. "Typical. We'll try again next week." Charles said nothing, but that night he returned to the security footage from the playroom, unable to let it go. He replayed the moment Maya had guided Carter's fingers across the drum. At first it looked like simple play, but then he saw the subtle pressure she applied to nerve points along his fingertips, the gentle tapping near his toes, the rhythm matched to the humming. It wasn't random. It was precise, purposeful, experienced. He searched her file, which he had once skimmed without care. Buried in the notes, he found it. 3 years as a rehabilitation assistant through New Hope Church's therapeutic ministry, working with disabled and trauma-affected children, sensory stimulation, nonverbal engagement, music and touch as therapy. He sat back in his chair, stunned. The woman he had dismissed as a maid had knowledge, skill, and experience that none of his expensive specialists possessed. He remembered the word she had left him with: grace. For the first time in years, Charles Whitmore questioned not just his staff, not just his doctors, but himself. And so the house of silence began to shift. Not yet with music, not yet with laughter, but with a crack in the armor of a man who had forgotten what it meant to hope, fractures, and first steps. The morning after Maya's departure carried with it an oppressive silence, heavier even than the usual stillness of the Whitmore estate. The children's playroom sat abandoned, the broken drum still lying in pieces where Charles had smashed it, its splintered skin like a wound left unhealed. Charles walked past the room without entering, though he slowed his steps as if something unseen held him there. Behind the door he could almost imagine the sound of Maya's humming, soft as wind through tall grass, guiding his sons into a rhythm of laughter and possibility. But the silence that greeted him instead was merciless. He carried on, coffee in hand, his face an iron mask. The twins, Caleb and Carter, were subdued at breakfast. They picked at their food without appetite, and their eyes flickered toward the empty chair where Maya used to stand, quietly overseeing their meals with a patience that never demanded recognition. Charles, distractions of lullabies and makeshift instruments. Still, when Caleb whispered to his brother, "Maya would have made us laugh," the words pierced through him like a shard of glass. He swallowed his coffee as though the bitterness might drown the guilt rising in his chest. Dr. Feldman arrived later that day, briefcase in hand and authority radiating from every measured movement. He carried with him the weight of medical science, the clinical certainty that left no room for what he deemed folk practices. Yet Charles, standing in the doorway with arms folded, could not ignore how the boys shrank from the doctor's presence. Feldman held up flashcards, coaxed their responses, tapped their knees with a reflex hammer, but the twins turned inward, their eyes clouded, their bodies stiff with resistance, when Carter crossed his arms and Caleb buried his face. In his sleeve, Feldman muttered something about stubborn regression and overexposure to untrained influences. Charles offered no argument, but as he watched Feldman leave with a forced smile of dismissal, he felt the hollowness of a man clinging to certainty while his world slipped through his fingers that night. After the staff had retreated to their quarters, Charles sat alone in his study, a glass of bourbon untouched beside him. His eyes remained fixed on the glowing screen of his laptop. He had queued up the security footage again. He had watched it 3 times already, but something compelled him to press play once more. There was Maya, kneeling beside Carter, her fingers brushing over his small hands with deliberate precision. The sound had no volume on the recording, but Charles remembered her humming. He leaned closer, watching carefully as she tapped her fingertips along nerve points, aligning rhythm with gentle pressure. It was not random, it was deliberate. Each movement flowed with a knowledge that was neither accident nor guesswork. She was not just entertaining them, she was guiding them, stimulating muscles and nerves through patterns that Charles, for all his wealth and learning, had never considered. His throat tightened as realization dawned. She had been right there, carrying ounces in her hands, and he had crushed her under the weight of his pride. Unable to sleep, Charles searched through Maya's employment file again. The words stared back at him with quiet authority. 3 years with New Hope Church's therapeutic ministry. Rehabilitation for trauma-affected and disabled children. Specialized in sensory stimulation and nonverbal engagement. How had he missed this? Or worse, how had he dismissed it so easily? When he had first skimmed her background, he had been blinded by prejudice, by the arrogance of believing that expertise came only with degrees and titles, not with experience and compassion. And now, that blindness haunted him. The following morning, the weight of doubt followed him into the garden. The spring air was crisp, carrying the scent of hydrangeas blooming near the hedges. Charles paused when he heard a sound faint, delicate, almost too fragile to believe. Peering through the hedge, he saw his sons sitting in the grass, their backs to him. Caleb tapped a stick against a stone. Carter drummed his fingers on his knees. Both of them were humming, uneven and off-key, but the melody was familiar. This little light of mine, I'm going to let it shine. Charles's breath caught. He leaned closer, hardly daring to blink. Caleb shifted and with effort lifted his foot slightly, tapping it in time with the rhythm. Carter, eyes locked on a butterfly that fluttered just out of reach, strained forward. His body shook with the effort. But then, astonishingly, he managed to lift himself for 2 clumsy, trembling steps before collapsing back into the grass, laughing breathlessly. "Did you see that?" Carter shouted, his voice alive with triumph. Caleb clapped his hands wildly, whispering, "Maya said one day we'd fly." Charles dropped his coffee cup, the porcelain shattering on the patio tiles, but the boys did not notice. He stood frozen, eyes wide, heart pounding, as a feeling he had not allowed himself in years surged through him. Hope. It was terrifying in its intensity, overwhelming in its possibility. His sons had moved not because of Feldman's flashcards, not because of expensive equipment, but because of Maya's songs and touch. Because of something deeper than science alone. That evening, Charles did something he had not done in years. He left the mansion without his entourage, without his chauffeur, without the armor of his public persona. He drove himself to a modest apartment complex on the far side of town. When Maya opened the door, surprise flickered across her face. She wore no uniform, only a simple blouse and jeans, her braid undone. Her expression remained guarded, but her eyes carried the quiet strength he had overlooked. Charles cleared his throat, his voice rough. "I came to say I was wrong." The words felt foreign on his tongue, but they were true. "I watched the footage. I read your file." "I saw what?" "You did." "What they did after, I know now." Maya's gaze did not soften. She folded her arms, her voice calm but firm. "You humiliated me, Mr. Whitmore. In front of your staff, you made me feel like nothing." Charles lowered his head. "I know, and I cannot undo it. But I can do better, if you give me that chance. I want to ask you to come back not as a maid, but as their caregiver, their guide." For a long moment, silence stretched between them, then a small voice interrupted. "Maya?" It was Carter, barefoot in his pajamas, clutching Caleb's hand. They had followed their father, their eyes wide with hope. "Please don't go away again," Caleb whispered. "We miss your songs," Carter added softly. Maya's breath caught, her composure faltering as she bent down to cup their cheeks. "I missed you too, sweethearts." When she looked up at Charles, her expression was resolute. "I'll come back, but not for you, for them." Charles nodded, humbled in a way he had never been before. For the first time, pride no longer mattered. What mattered was the light flickering back into his son's eyes. The next morning, the estate felt different. The marble halls that once echoed with silence now carried the faint hum of a melody drifting from the playroom. The staff moved quietly, their expressions wary, but the sound of Caleb's laughter and Carter's off-key humming cut through the air like sunlight through storm clouds. Charles stood in the doorway, his hand resting on the mahogany frame, watching without stepping inside. Maya sat cross-legged on the rug, colorful scarves spread across the floor. The twins waved them clumsily in the air, following her gentle rhythm. Their movements were awkward, imperfect, but alive. Charles felt something stir deep within him, a fragile warmth he had not known since Rose's passing. For the first time in years, the Whitmore mansion felt alive. Not bustling, not crowded, but alive in a way that startled him. He realized with sudden clarity that it was not Maya who had broken his house, but silence, pride, and fear. And now, perhaps, she was the only one who could help him piece it back. Together again, the war between certainty and hope. The Whitmore estate, once a tomb of quiet despair, began to stir with faint but unmistakable signs of life. For weeks, Maya's return had introduced rhythms that seemed to ripple through every corridor, where there had once been only silence punctuated by the ticking of antique clocks. There was now the flutter of scarves, the rattle of tambourines, and the hum of soft voices learning how to laugh again. Caleb and Carter, though still bound by the fragility of their limbs, had begun to move with cautious eagerness, as if each day under Maya's care reminded them of something their bodies had not yet forgotten, that they were children, capable of play, wonder, and discovery. Charles, often standing at a distance, watched with an unease he could not name. His mind was a battlefield where the cold authority of science clashed violently with the living evidence of his son's progress. On one side of that battlefield stood Dr. Feldman, whose voice carried the weight of credentials and years of experience. Feldman returned regularly, briefcase in hand, each visit laden with carefully prepared charts and clinical routines. Yet his sessions remained sterile, met with resistance from the boys who had grown weary of being measured, prodded, and labeled. Caleb turned his face away whenever Feldman tried to engage him, and Carter crossed his arms with the stubbornness of a child who had learned that silence was safer than disappointment. Feldman's frustration grew with every visit. He muttered about fantasy interferences and warned Charles that allowing Maya to blur the lines of treatment would set them back irreparably. On the other side stood Maya with no degree to frame on a wall, no license to command respect in the world of medicine. Yet what she carried was something harder to dismiss: her hands. He zoomed in on her hands, the way she tapped at Caleb's toes, the way she pressed Carter's fingers into rhythm before guiding him to lift. He could not deny the deliberateness, nor the results. Yet Feldman's warnings rang in his ears: emotional illusions don't change neurology. What if this fragile hope was only temporary? What if tomorrow they woke up unable to move again, leaving him with nothing but shattered belief? Charles had built his empire on certainties, on figures and facts that could be calculated, controlled. Hope, however, was the one currency he distrusted most, for it had betrayed him before. One evening, unable to contain his conflict, Charles summoned Maya into the study. She entered quietly, her posture calm, her eyes steady. He gestured toward the leather chair opposite his desk, the same chair where he had once dismissed her in fury. The irony was not lost on him. "I owe you more than an apology," he began, his voice measured but taut. "But I need to understand. What exactly do you do with them? How do you make them move when others cannot?" Maya folded her hands in her lap, her expression thoughtful. "Children carry memory in their bodies," she explained softly. "Even when their legs don't work as we want them to, the nerves remember. Music and touch together remind the body that it can still respond. I don't force them. I remind them. I give them space to try without fear." Her words unsettled him. They were simple, almost too simple, and yet they carried a wisdom that years of expensive specialists had not delivered. He frowned, leaning forward. "But you're not a doctor." "You don't have the training." "No," she interrupted gently, but firmly. "I'm not a doctor. But I've worked with children who were told they'd never walk, never speak, never feed themselves. Some of them do now. Not because of me alone, but because someone believed in them enough to keep trying. I don't promise miracles, Mr. Whitmore. I promise effort. And effort is what your sons need more than anything else." Charles sat back in his chair, his jaw tight, his mind reeling. He had spent millions bringing in world-class physicians, flown experts across oceans, surrounded his sons with the best that money could buy. Yet here sat a maid speaking with a certainty that came not from credentials but from experience and conviction, and he could not deny that her results spoke louder than Feldman's reports ever had. Still, pride warred with humility. "My wife believed in things like this," he muttered, almost to himself. "She believed too much, and in the end it killed her hope." Maya's gaze softened. "No, it's what kept her alive long enough to give you these two. Hope isn't weakness, Mr. Whitmore. It's strength. But it takes courage to hold on to it." The words struck him deeper than he wanted to admit. He turned away, staring at the fireplace as though it might offer answers. For a long moment the study was silent, save for the crackle of the flames. When he looked back, Maya was still watching him, patient, unflinching. He realized then that he had never truly looked at her, not as staff, not as an outsider, but as a woman whose strength came not from wealth or position, but from an uncheckable belief in the value of every small step forward. The following afternoon, Maya led the twins into the garden once again. Charles followed at a distance, his presence hidden behind the veranda pillars. The sun filtered through magnolia branches, painting the grass in dappled gold. Maya laid a blanket on the lawn and placed ribbon wands in the boys' hands. At first, they hesitated, their movements stiff, their legs uncertain. But Maya knelt beside them, her voice rising in a soft melody, her hand tapping gently against the earth in rhythm. Slowly, Caleb rose to his knees, waving the ribbon like a banner in the wind. Carter followed, his small body trembling, yet his determination fierce. When a butterfly drifted past, Carter lurched forward, laughter spilling from him as he nearly stumbled, but kept upright for a heartbeat longer than the last attempt. Charles gripped the veranda, railing so tightly his knuckles turned white. His heart pounded with every unsteady movement, every wobbling step. He wanted to rush forward, to steady them, to control the moment before it collapsed. But Maya's glance upward, calm, steady, commanding him silently to wait, held him back. He understood then that his presence, his instinct to control, could break what was being built. And so, for the first time, Charles Whitmore allowed himself to stand still, powerless, and watched Dot by the time she guided the boys back inside. Their cheeks were flushed, their eyes bright, their laughter echoing across the lawn. Charles stood frozen, unable to retreat to the safety of his study. He met them at the door instead, bending down as Carter declared proudly, "Daddy, we chased a butterfly." The words were so simple, but they landed with the weight of a miracle. That night, Charles did not pour himself bourbon. Instead, he lingered outside the twins' bedroom, listening as Maya's voice carried through the crack of the door. She told them a story about a sparrow who refused to stop singing even when the storm raged louder than its wings. The boys listened, their eyes heavy but filled with wonder. Charles leaned against the wall, tears stinging his eyes, realizing that for the first time in years, he was not the only one keeping watch over his sons, and in that moment he understood that his war between certainty and hope was not yet over, but, perhaps for the first time, it was a war worth fighting. Breaking the fortress, the Whitmore estate had always been a fortress, built not only of stone and wealth, but of routine, control, and silence. Its staff operated like gears in a machine, predictable, polished, and unquestioning. Yet ever since Maya's return, the machine no longer turned so smoothly. Music crept into corridors where silence had been law. Laughter echoed off marble where once only the shuffle of polished shoes had been heard. And bright scarves, paper ribbons, and improvised instruments turned polished rooms into playgrounds. For the twins, this was life returning. For many among the staff, it was chaos, disorder, and the crumbling of the old order that had once been their pride. And for Charles, it was both a revelation and a reckoning. He noticed the whispers first. In the kitchen, he overheard two longtime maids, women who had served his family for decades, muttering while arranging trays of silverware. "He's gone soft," one said bitterly. "Letting that woman run the house like she owns it. Next thing you know, she be sitting at his table?" The other chuckled cruelly. "She already has his sons eating from her hand. Soon she have him too." Their voices stung more than he cared to admit. Once, he might have agreed with them, might have dismissed Maya as nothing more than a servant overstepping her place. But now, after witnessing his son's eyes come alive, after hearing Carter's proud declaration that he had chased a butterfly, Charles could not unsee the truth. That night, without ceremony, he dismissed both women from service. Their outrage rippled through the rest of the staff like shockwaves. The message was clear: Maya was under his protection now. And though resentment still lingered in hushed tones, no one dared speak openly again. But silencing staff was not the same as silencing doubt. Dr. Feldman returned more often, his face drawn with disapproval, his tone clipped with irritation. He arrived one morning with new charts, new diagrams, and a proposal for an intensive program in another city. "You cannot rely on unverified methods," he argued sharply, his voice filling the study where Charles sat listening with folded arms. "What progress you think you've seen is anecdotal at best. These children need structured, evidence-based therapy. If you let sentiment guide you, you will destroy what little chance they have." Charles wanted to believe him. Feldman's words had the weight of authority, the kind that had guided him through every business deal and decision in his empire. But every time the doctor's voice pressed its case, the image of his sons stumbling, laughing, singing, pushed back harder. "They are responding to her," Charles said firmly, surprising even himself with the conviction in his tone. "For the first time they are responding?" Feldman's eyes narrowed. "To fantasy, to illusions. You're letting your grief cloud your judgment? Your wife believed in fairy tales too, and look where that left you." The mention of Rose's name struck Charles like a blade. For a moment, his composure cracked, his jaw tightening as grief threatened to spill over. But then something shifted. He straightened, his voice cold. "You will not speak of my wife again. And you will not undermine Maya in this house." Feldman's expression hardened, but he gathered his things without further argument. As the door closed behind him, Charles realized what he had done. He had chosen Stone of children who became heroes simply because they refused to give up. And under her care, Caleb began pulling himself upright against walls, his balance shaky but improving, while Carter, though slower, discovered strength in his determination. Each attempt more deliberate than the last. Charles watched all of this with a heart caught between awe and terror. Awe, because his sons were blossoming before his eyes, reclaiming pieces of childhood long stolen from them. Terror, because he feared it could all vanish, leaving him broken again. Late at night, he found himself pacing before the monitors, replaying the day's footage as if to convince himself it had truly happened. Every laugh, every stumble, every clumsy step was precious and fragile. Hope, he realized, was like glass. Beautiful, but so easy to shatter. One evening, after the twins had fallen asleep, Charles lingered outside their room. Maya sat at the foot of their beds, humming softly while stroking their hair. He watched through the crack in the door as their breathing slowed, their small bodies relaxing into slumber. When she finally rose and turned, she found him waiting in the hallway. "You don't have to keep guard every night," she said gently. "They're safe." "I'm not guarding," he replied gruffly, though his voice betrayed the weariness behind it. "I'm making sure." "You're afraid they'll fail," she said quietly, folding her arms. "But failure isn't the enemy, Mr. Whitmore. Fear is, and fear has already taken enough from this house." Her words lingered with him long after she had gone to her quarters. That night, as he lay awake in his cavernous bedroom, Charles realized that Maya was not simply teaching his children. She was teaching him that to love was to risk, to hope was to trust, and to trust meant surrendering control, but surrendering control was the hardest lesson of all. And soon that lesson would be tested in ways that neither he nor Maya expected. Shadows of Doubtspring had deepened across Charleston, and with it the Whitmore estate no longer felt like a mausoleum of polished stone and grieving silence. Sunlight seemed to linger longer through its tall windows, and in place of hollow echoes came the sound of Carter's uneven laughter and Caleb's playful claps as Maya coaxed them into games disguised as therapy. For weeks Charles had lived in a strange balance between wonder and dread, every small step forward filling him with awe while simultaneously gnawing at his fear that it might all collapse in an instant. He had begun to participate more, sitting on the floor with his sons during their scarf games, clumsily trying to mimic their rhythms, even letting his deep baritone hum join Maya's soft melodies. Yet behind his growing involvement, shadows of doubt clung to him like stubborn ghosts that refused to leave. It was Dr. Feldman who fanned those shadows into flame. He returned one afternoon with a face set in disapproval and a new file tucked beneath his arm. In the library, with Charles seated across the desk, he laid out images, charts, and diagnoses, his voice cold and sharp. "Charles, I warned you. That indulging fantasy would only harm them. They've regressed under her care. Look here, their progress metrics have flatlined since you let her interfere. If you continue down this path, you are gambling with their future." He tapped the file with a finger, the sound sharp against the oak desk. "Do you want to be the father who wasted critical time on folk songs while his children's chances dwindled away?" Charles felt the words burrow deep, latching onto his deepest insecurities. He clenched his jaw, recalling the broken drum, the laughter of his staff when Maya was humiliated, the arrogance in his own fury. But then, against the tide of guilt, rose the memory of Carter chasing a butterfly, the sound of Caleb whispering Maya said one day we'd fly. He closed the file slowly, his voice low but resolute. "You see charts, I see my sons. They are not numbers, Feldman. They are children, and under her care they are alive?" The doctor scoffed, his frustration raw. "Alive is not enough. They need structure, rigor, medical precision, not illusions. Not a maid who fancies herself a healer." The insult burned, but Charles did not flinch this time. "Say what you will, but if you cannot respect her, then you will no longer set foot in this house." Feldman's eyes widened, stunned. For years his word had been law within the estate, but now he gathered his things with stiff movements and left without another word. When the heavy doors shut behind him, Charles felt the weight of his decision press against his chest. He had cast aside the authority of science for the uncertain faith of hope. And though he believed it was right, fear whispered in the quiet corners of his mind, what if he had been wrong? In the days that followed, doubt took its chance to strike. The twins faced setbacks that rattled even Maya's composure. Caleb, who had begun pulling himself upright with growing confidence, suddenly refused to try, retreating into stubborn silence whenever she encouraged him. Carter, who had managed clumsy steps before, stumbled more often, his frustration boiling into tears. One morning, when his legs buckled and he collapsed against Maya's lap, he sobbed into her arms. "I can't do it anymore." Charles had been standing at the doorway, and the sound of his son's despair pierced him deeper than any of Feldman's words. He nearly stormed in, ready to end what he feared was torment disguised as therapy. But Maya met his eyes with a steady gaze that froze him in place. "He will try again," she said softly, rubbing Carter's back, "but not today. Today he needs to know it's all right to rest." Later that evening, Charles found himself pacing his study, unable to shake the image of his son crying in defeat. He poured himself bourbon but left it untouched on the desk, staring instead at the flickering security footage once again. He replayed the stumble, the tears, Maya's calm voice, and then he noticed something that steadied his trembling doubts. After Carter's sobs had quieted, after Maya had soothed him with gentle words, the boy's fingers still tapped lightly against her arm, keeping rhythm with her song even in exhaustion. It was not failure, it was persistence, hidden beneath fatigue. The realization loosened something tight in Charles's chest. Though fear still lingered, the staff, sensing his wavering, grew restless again. Whispers filled the hallways, complaints that Maya had been given too much authority, that the estate was unraveling under her influence. Some muttered that Charles was blinded by grief, that he had mistaken sentiment for progress. One evening he overheard two of his longest-serving attendants murmuring in the pantry, "The boys may laugh now, but laughter won't make them walk. He's letting her turn this house upside down." Charles stood in the shadows, fists clenched. The old Charles, the man who demanded silence, order, and control, might have agreed once. But now he stepped into the light, his voice firm. "If any of you cannot respect Maya, you no longer belong in this house." The words echoed through the pantry like a verdict. By morning, 2 more staff members were gone. The rest grew quiet, subdued, but Charles knew their resentment still simmered beneath the surface. The world outside the gates noticed as well. At a charity event, Charles overheard whispers among old associates. "Have you heard? He's let a maid take over his son's care." Another voice scoffed, "Whitmore's lost his edge. Grief has made him a fool." Their laughter was discreet but cruel, and for a moment Charles felt the old shame flare, the urge to defend his reputation, stronger than the courage to defend his choices. But when he returned to the hotel lounge and found his sons laughing as they played a rhythm game with Maya, their joy pulling him into their circle until even his hands clumsily joined the beat, he realized reputation meant nothing compared to the light returning to their faces. That night, after the twins had fallen asleep, Maya found him in the library staring at Rose's old journals. He had opened one, his hand trembling over her handwriting. "She believed in music," he whispered, his voice raw. "She believed in too much, and it killed her." Maya sat quietly across from him, her eyes steady. "No, Mr. Whitmore, it's what kept her alive. Hope didn't kill her. Hopelessness almost killed you. But your sons need more than a man who survives. They need a father who believes." Her words landed like stone in his chest, heavy but grounding. For a long moment neither spoke. Then, quietly, he said, "Teach me. Not just them, teach me how to believe again." And in that fragile confession, the fortress that had stood around Charles Whitmore for years cracked wide open. For the first time, he allowed himself not only to watch hope through the eyes of his sons, but to step into it himself. He did not yet know if it would last. He did not yet know if it would end in triumph or tragedy. But as he looked at Maya, across the library, with the faint echoes of his children's laughter drifting through the halls, he realized he was no longer willing to choose silence over the sound of life. The day of gray summer. Sunlight poured across the Whitmore estate, in golden streams, flooding through the tall windows and chasing away the long shadows that had once ruled its halls. What had begun months ago as a fragile experiment, a whispered hum and a broken drum, had now transformed the mansion into something alive. The marble corridors no longer echoed with cold silence, but with the between the man who had built his empire on certainties and the father, who was slowly learning to risk everything for fragile hope. That war reached its breaking point when Dr. Feldman returned uninvited. He came not alone this time, but with two colleagues, sharp-suited specialists, who spoke with the kind of clinical confidence that had once reassured Charles. They sat in the study like judges at a tribunal, their words clipped and their tones heavy with warning. "Mr. Whitmore," Feldman began, sliding a report across the desk, "we have reviewed your son's progress. While you may believe you've seen improvement, the truth is their condition requires structured rehabilitation, not illusions. Every day spent with untrained methods is a day lost to proper care." Another doctor added, "Sentimentality cannot replace science. What you are doing is dangerous not only for their bodies, but for their long-term development. You're risking irreversible harm." Charles listened in silence, his hand resting against the oak desk, his mind a storm. Once, he might have bowed to their authority. Once, he would have dismissed Maya with a single word. But now, when he looked up from the reports, he saw not charts and statistics, but the memory of Carter's trembling steps toward a butterfly, Caleb's laughter as he clapped in rhythm, their voices singing together in the garden. He rose slowly, his presence towering, his voice steady but charged. "For years I let your charts dictate their lives. For years I watched them shrink further into silence. And in a matter of weeks, she has given them more than you ever did hope, joy, the will to try again. You see risks, I see life, and I will not let you take that from them." The words rang with finality. Feldman bristled, his pride wounded. "You are choosing fantasy over reason." Charles's jaw tightened. "No, I'm choosing my sons." He dismissed them with a gesture, and the doctors left with stiff indignation. When the heavy doors closed, Charles stood motionless, his breath sharp, his chest tight. For the first time, he had broken fully from the fortress of certainty he had clung to for years. It was terrifying, but it was freedom, yet freedom did not erase fear. That very week, the boys suffered another setback. During a session in the garden, Caleb fell hard onto the grass, his small body crumpling as pain twisted his face. Carter, startled, stumbled too, landing in a heap beside him. Both boys cried, their tears slicing through the warm afternoon like thunderclouds. Charles, watching from the veranda, rushed forward, his heart pounding with panic. He knelt beside them, his instinct screaming to scoop them up, to end this cruel attempt at progress. But before he could act, Maya's voice cut through the chaos, calm and firm. "Let them feel it, Mr. Whitmore. Falling is part of walking. If you never let them fall, they will never learn to rise." Her words struck him like a revelation. He froze, trembling, torn between fear and faith. The boys, sobbing, clung to her, and slowly, under her soothing voice, their cries quieted. Caleb looked up, eyes still wet, and whispered, "I want to. Try again." Carter nodded, wiping his tears with determination. Charles watched, stunned, as his sons pushed themselves upright once more, shaky but resolute. It was then he realized Maya was not shielding them from failure. She was teaching them courage, the courage to rise even after the fall. That night, Charles sat alone in the library, Rose's journal open before him. His hands trembled as he read her words, written years before her death. "If I am gone, tell. Then their father has music in his soul, even if he forgets how to hear it. Tell them he once sang to them before they were born." He closed the journal, tears burning in his eyes. For so long he had buried her hope, dismissing it as weakness, a dangerous luxury. But now he understood it had not been weakness at all. It had been the greatest strength she possessed, and it was the gift Maya was passing back into his home. The turning point came on a morning, heavy with tension and possibility. Maya had prepared a new exercise in the courtyard. She tied small bells to the boys' ankles and handed them ribbons to hold for balance. "Today," she said softly, "we walk together." The boys looked nervous, their small faces etched with determination and fear. Charles stood close, his breath uneven, every muscle in his body taut with anticipation. As Maya began to hum, the boys took their first steps forward, one, then two, then three. The bells jingled with each movement, the sound bright and defiant, against the silence that had once ruled the estate. Caleb stumbled but caught himself. Carter wavered but pressed forward. And then, together, they crossed the courtyard. Unsteady but unbroken, Charles felt his heart hammering, his eyes blurring with tears. He could not contain it. He rushed forward, scooping them into his arms, laughter and sobs spilling from him. In the same breath, "I'm proud of you," he whispered hoarsely. "So proud." The boys clung to him, their ribbons fluttering like banners of victory in the summer air. Maya stood a few steps away, her eyes glistening, her smile quiet. But radiant that evening, as the sun set over the estate, Charles gathered the household staff in the great hall. His voice was calm but resolute. "This house has been ruled by silence and fear for too long. No more. From this day forward, Maya is not staff. She is family. And anyone who cannot accept that has no place here." His words reverberated through the hall, leaving no room for doubt. Some lowered their eyes in shame, others stiffened in resistance, but none dared speak. The fortress had been broken, and in its place stood something far stronger, a home dot in the weeks that followed. The twins' progress grew steadier. They still stumbled, they still faltered, but each fall was followed by determination, each setback by courage. Charles, once the man who had watched from shadows, now joined openly. He played drums beside them, his rhythm clumsy but joyful. He hummed lullabies in his deep voice, rediscovering the music he had buried with Rose, and on quiet nights he walked the halls not in search of silence but to listen for the sound of his sons' breathing, their dreams no longer weighed down by despair. One evening, as the boys drifted to sleep, Maya told them another story about a sparrow that sang through the storm until the sun returned. Charles stood in the doorway, his heart full, his eyes wet, realizing that the sparrow was not only his sons. It was Maya, it was Rose, and in some small way it was him, too. For the first time in years, Charles Whitmore no longer feared hope. He embraced it. And in that embrace he discovered grace, not the kind that wealth could buy or power could demand, but the kind that came quietly, in laughter, in music, in the courage to rise after the fall. And so the house that had once been a fortress of grief became a sanctuary of life.